Here we begin our review of Chapter 6, Key Issue 4, which is the religious conflicts, and where we see these religious conflicts located. We're going to focus mainly today on religion versus government policies, and within that, religion versus social change and religion versus communism. This is when the religion is at odds with the government and the government policies. Then the other will be religion versus religion, and we will highlight specifically the religious wars in the Middle East and the religious wars in Ireland. So let's take a look first at the idea of religion versus government policies and what we mean by this. So when we look at this, the role of religion in organizing the Earth's surface, it has diminished in some societies owing to political and economic change, this idea of globalization. So you begin to see this conflict between the idea of modernization and traditional religious values. These are at odds with one another. In recent years, some of the religious principles have become increasingly important in the political organization of some countries. You see this in some countries where they have various branch of Christianity or Islam, some where you see this has been at odds with Hinduism as well. Let's start with religion versus social change, this idea of Taliban versus Western values. This is, as we look at this conflict between modernization and the traditional values, the Taliban, these were a group of people in Afghanistan who they came into government power in 1996. So they were a group of people who were actually they were the ruling body of the government in Afghanistan. And they immediately instituted very strict religious rules. Women head to toe in burqa. Women could no longer go out without a close male escort. That male escort had to be a husband or a close family member. People could no longer listen to Western music or watch Western films. Women could no longer go to school. Women could not wear perfume. Men had to have the adequate length of beard. And there was a group called the Religious Police who would go around and they would enforce this law. And if people were found to be not adhering or abusing this law, then they were severely punished. In Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan, there was a soccer stadium, and they turned that soccer stadium into a public execution center. And so Afghanistan prior to, while there had been quite a few political and economic social issues, it was progressive in its that it was they had institutions of higher learning. They had adopted for quite some time communism. Women were more participant in society, and the Taliban instituted this strict Islamic rule immediately, trying in what they believed to be controlling and reorienting the population. And what the Taliban did was they allowed Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda to set up training camps in Afghanistan. And this was in the late 1990s. And then in 2001, obviously, September 11th, was the tragedies in New York and Washington, D.C. and in Pennsylvania. And these 9/11 hijackers, they had been trained by Al-Qaeda. And so in retaliation to this, the United States government, we engaged in the war in Afghanistan with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And our mission was to destroy Al-Qaeda and their training camps, to capture Osama bin Laden, and to remove the Taliban from power. And so this was the war in Afghanistan, really was the Taliban and Al-Qaeda versus the United States and our Western allies, the European countries, and South Korea and Australia. That war is still continuing today. Next, we have religion versus social change. This is Hinduism versus social equality. This is in India. And keeping in mind, when we talk about religion versus social change, we're talking about modernization and globalization. and as it conflicts with traditional religious views. So Hinduism has been strongly challenged since the 1800s, when the British colonial administrators introduced their social and moral concepts to India. And the most vulnerable aspect of the Hindu religion was its rigid caste system. The caste system is a social class system, and it divides groups into social classes. And once a group is born into that social class, what as a person is born into it, it is very difficult to change in this life form. And so this did lead to some significant discrimination amongst the groups. And the British administrators and the Christian missionaries were critical of the caste system, the social class system, such as the neglect of the untouchables, the lowest social class, their health and their economic problems. Again, there's this somewhat of a belief that the people, they deserve this situation in life because of the cycle of reincarnation, the birth and the rebirth of the soul into a new, different life form based on one's karma and dharma and previous life. And so the Indian government, they legally abolished the untouchable caste, and the people who were formerly in that caste now have, formally they have equal rights with other Indians, but socially you do still see this discrimination within India. Again, this is this idea of this caste system. So this would be another conflict in the area. It would be mainly in India. And this is Hinduism versus, and the caste system versus this more modernization and the social equality. Next, let's talk about this idea of religion versus communism. And specifically, let's talk about Orthodox Christianity and Islam versus the Soviet Union. Keeping in mind that in communism, communists believe that communism itself is a belief system and so is at odds with organized, structured religion. Communists believe that religion does create social hierarchy and social divisions, and they believe that all people should be treated and viewed equally. And so the Soviet Union was the former USSR, so it was the communist Russia. You can see this is what was very representative and emblematic of that at the time. And so this organized religion was challenged in the 20th century by the rise of communism in Eastern Europe and Asia. And basically the revolution, the communist revolution in Russia was around the 1917. And following the 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, this was the communist revolution in Russia. The communist government of the Soviet Union pursued anti-religious programs, and people's religious beliefs could not be destroyed overnight, but the role of the organized religion in Russian Soviet life was reduced. All church buildings and property were nationalized and could be used only with the local government permission, which was very difficult to obtain. And this with this religious organizations prevented from conducting social and cultural work, the religion dwindled in daily life. And this was really at odds with the more faithful of the groups, the Orthodox Christianity, the Eastern Orthodox, especially in the Eastern European countries, and then those that were more traditionally Islamic. And you saw this a lot in Central Asia. One good example would be Afghanistan. And so they did fight back against this at some point. The end of communist rule in the late 20th century brought a religious revival in Eastern Europe, especially where Roman Catholicism was the most prevalent branch. You saw this very much in places like Czech Republic. Property was that had been confiscated by the communist government, reverted back to the church ownership, and attendance at church services did increase. Many of the Central Asian countries that were former parts of the Soviet Union, they're still struggling to determine the extent to which laws should be rewritten to conform to Islamic custom rather than to the secular tradition inherited from the Soviet Union. So in many of these former Soviet countries in Central Asia, and they are trying to institute laws, and many of the laws would be heavily influenced by the Muslim principles. And so they're really in trying to determine this idea of modernization and globalization and more secular, so anti-religious Soviet influence that they've had for many years versus what would be a more traditional conservative principles coming from their faith. Next, let's talk about religion versus communism, and that would have been Buddhism versus Southeast Asian countries. You saw this especially in the peninsula that encompasses Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. And so many Buddhists, they were hurt by the long Vietnam War. Remember the Vietnam War? This would have been in the mid to late 1960s into the 1970s. And this would have been Vietnam War, the Korean War. This was, the war really was the communism versus democracy. And so communism was pushing in, and then democracy was trying to push them back out. And in some countries like North Korea, communism did prevail. Vietnam is also communism prevailed. And so again, in communism, they don't allow for the open practice of religion. And specifically, they targeted the Buddhist monks and those who were the most traditional practitioners of Buddhism. And so in protest, many Buddhist monks during the Vietnam War, they did douse themselves in gasoline and set themselves on fire to burn to death in the street, and hoping that this would bring more publicity to their cause. And even today, the current communist governments in Southeast Asia have discouraged religious practices and permitted many of their monuments to decay. And these countries, they do not have the funds necessary to restore the structures. And some are being restored in like Thailand, some areas of Cambodia, only mainly because of tourist attraction destination. But because of the communist governments allowed them to go into disrepair, this is a significant issue. And finally, let's talk about religion versus religion. This is when religions are at odds, mainly as a dispute over control of the government or to control of holy lands and territory. Conflicts are most likely to occur at a boundary between two religious groups. Two long-standing conflicts involving religious groups are in the Middle East. Here we have Israel, and in Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland, remember, is part of the United Kingdom. So here's Northern Ireland, here is Ireland. Let's talk about the wars in the Middle East. This would be mainly Jews versus the Muslims. This is in Israel, mainly, and this is fight over the control of the Holy Lands. This really dates back hundreds, thousands of years. Crusades were holy wars to control this territory between the Christians and the Muslims, and the riches that were in these lands, and then control of the Holy Lands, especially in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth. And today, this is still it's much more of a conflict. Israel is a Jewish country, a Jewish state, but there are many Palestinians who are Muslims who are living in Israel. They have not come to agreement on the two-state system, and then surrounded by Muslims. And so this is mainly a dispute over this territory of Israel, Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and then the West Bank, and then Jerusalem. So after the creation of Israel in 1947, this conflict really began between the Jews and the Muslims and came to a head. And so here we have the way that even in Jerusalem, part of the issue is that there are holy sites basically right near one another that are sacred to all three of the faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Finally, here we have again some information about the Crusades between the Christians and the Muslims, these holy wars, and you can see how long this dates back. These are the boundary changes in Palestine, Israel over the years. Same with the West Bank political. And then finally we have the war in Ireland, Northern Ireland, the Catholics versus the Protestants for political